Imagine you are a ruler after a catastrophe. The old law has burned. People live in the ruins and wait for whom to believe now. In your hands are the army, laws, and the right to decide where the truth lies. 3 texts are placed on your table. One is called Moses' Law, the other, the New Testament, and the third, the Quran. Each can be proclaimed the Word of God and used to divide the planet. What will you choose? To honestly say that this is your instrument of power, or to present it as a divine revelation, so that people fear not you, but the law of God, written in the language of your power? The problem is that this choice has already been made for us, and these 3 sacred texts have become 3 incompatible laws for the same planet. Open any school history textbook. On the pages devoted to the Middle Ages, you will inevitably encounter mentions of the Golden Horde, of the Mongol conquerors, of the great Khans, whose power extended from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe. Historians rely on the accounts of travelers from that era, on records made by those who supposedly saw these distant lands with their own eyes. But have you ever thought about reading these accounts in their entirety? Not the summary from the textbook, not quotes taken out of context, but the document itself from beginning to end. Take, for example, the notes of John of Plano Carpini, a Franciscan monk sent by the Pope in the mid-13th century. Historians call him the first European to visit the Mongol Empire and leave a written account. Entire chapters of textbooks are built on this text. Dissertations are defended, and a perception of that world is formed. The monk set out on a journey through Poland, Kiev, the steppe of the Polovtsians, and reached the encampment of Khan Batu, somewhere near Astrakhan on the Volga. His mission was officially called diplomatic, although the true aim was different. The Pope feared that the Tatar Mongols would reach Rome itself and sent an envoy to learn their intentions. And here is what this monk writes in his notes. When the Tatars were returning through the desert, they arrived in a certain land. There appeared monsters that had a feminine form. The men of that country had a dog-like appearance. When the harshest winter began, these dogmen jumped into the water, then rolled onto the shore and started to roll in the dirt. The water, mixed with mud, froze on their skins. They repeated this process again and again until a thick layer of ice formed on them. After that, the dogs attacked the Tatars. The arrows bounced off the icy armor as if off a stone wall. The Tatars could not inflict any harm on them, while the dogs wounded and killed many warriors, driving the invaders from their lands. Further in the text, people living underground are mentioned who cannot stand noise and sunlight, so they beat on drums to scare away unwanted guests. In another place, monsters with human heads, faces like dogs, and legs like bulls are described. They speak 2 words in human language and bark on the third, but they can be understood if you listen closely. Stop for a moment. Read these fragments carefully. Ice dogs warriors, creatures with a dual nature, an underground race that avoids light. It is on this foundation that your school curriculum on medieval history is built. It is to these lines that scholars refer when constructing theories about Mongol domination, trade routes, and the political structure of Asian lands. Carpini did not just record what he heard. He created a literary image of a wild, dangerous, inhuman East. The Russian clerics he refers to allegedly lived among the Tatars for a long time and confirmed the veracity of these stories. Even a proverb has survived. Your father was destroyed by dogs. The entire narrative is structured in such a way as to ensure the reader has no doubt. This is not a fabrication. This is the testimony of witnesses. Historians demonstrate remarkable selectivity. They ignore paragraphs about monstrous dogs, about underground dwellers, about people with bull legs. These lines are delicately skipped, not mentioned, not analyzed. However, when Carpini describes the Khans, their palaces, their customs, scholars take every word at face value. The monk tells about the great Khan, about his residence, about ceremonies, about military power, and historians carefully record these details, incorporating them into their works. Why such a duality? Either the entire text is reliable, or it is not reliable at all. One cannot choose convenient pieces from the same source while discarding the inconvenient ones. This is called manipulation of facts, manipulation of sources. Yet it is precisely on such manipulation that the official history of the Golden Horde, the Mongol Empire, and all of medieval East is built. What essentially is the difference between this text and The Journey Beyond Three Seas by Afanasy Nikitin? It is also a journey, also exotic lands, also stories about wonders. Or take The Book of the Diversity of the World by Marco Polo. Literary works written in a specific style, with a specific purpose. And that purpose was not to describe reality. Carpini travelled as a missionary sent by the Pope. His entire text is permeated with one task: to prove to the unreasonable but powerful Tatars the superiority of the Christian faith, the necessity of accepting the teachings of Jesus Christ. This means something critically important. The text was written after the New Testament appeared. Otherwise, what is the point of preaching something that does not yet exist? The monk carries a ready-made religious system, a formed doctrine, a finished teaching into the wild steppes. The task was not to capture reality, but to create an image of the wild East that needs civilization through Christianity. A literary fabrication to justify missionary expansion. Why were these fantasies about monsters and Khans needed? To construct a false history of wild peoples, to whom enlightened Europe brings the light of true faith. But what if everything was exactly the opposite? What if those who were called Tatars and Mongols were the remnants of a unified, highly developed civilization, of which only names on old maps remain? What if Carpini was sent not to learn about an unknown world, but to document the process of its destruction? His notes could serve as a report on how the mission to cleanse the old system and implement the new was progressing. Descriptions of monsters were needed to justify the actions of the missionaries, to show that they were bringing civilization to barbarians who were not even fully human. Open any map from the 16th or 17th century. There, where Siberia, the Urals, and the lands stretch all the way to the Pacific Ocean, you will see the inscription, Great Tartary, Grande Tartarie. Not a small principality, not an unknown province, but a vast territory with clear boundaries. On some maps, the capital is marked, the city of Tartary. There is a division into Moscow Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary. Cartographers drew borders, marked major cities, laid out trade routes. These maps were created not by dreamers, but by professional geographers working on behalf of royal courts and trading companies. The maps were worth a fortune because trade, military campaigns, and diplomatic agreements depended on their accuracy. And now open an 18th century map. Tartary is not there, at all. As if a giant empire that occupied half of Eurasia was erased with an eraser in just a few decades. The official version offers a simple explanation. Europeans supposedly used this name to refer to poorly studied eastern territories, a kind of geographical convention. However, such an interpretation falls apart upon a detailed examination of sources. On maps of that period, there were indeed designations for unexplored regions. They were marked with special symbols, left blank, or labeled with Latin phrases like terra incognita, which literally means unknown land. Tartary, on the other hand, was depicted quite differently, with detailed mountain ranges, river systems, indicating large settlements and trade routes. Cartographers invested the results of expensive expeditions, diplomatic missions, and trade voyages into these drawings. Imaginary kingdoms are not drawn like that, and the fact remains, in the 17th century, the empire occupied its place in the geopolitical landscape, and 100 years later, there was not even a mention of it. It did not split, reorganize, or merge into neighboring powers. It simply ceased to exist on paper, and along with it, in the historical memory of humanity. All over the world, architecture has been preserved that speaks of a common architectural language. The same stucco work, the same columns, the same proportions in Buenos Aires, Kiev, Vladivostok. Not different styles of various cultures, but identical elements, as if built according to the same blueprints. The trace of not different nations, but one empire that stretched across continents. And the first floors of these buildings are everywhere buried under soil, indicating a catastrophe that altered the landscape. After Tartary disappeared from the maps, active promotion of Christianity began in these regions. Missionary expeditions, like the one undertaken by Carpini, were part of the process of clearing the memory of the previous civilization. The new religion meant a new law, a new system of governance established on the ruins of the old empire. And here is the key point that is often overlooked. Religion at that time was not separated from the state. Religion was the state because religion is law. Imagine for a second such a picture. The president ascends the Ostankino Tower, takes out a notebook, and begins to write down amendments to the constitution that God personally dictates to him. Then he comes down and announces to the people, "These are not my laws. This is a divine revelation sent from above." If such a thing were shown on television every day, perhaps someone would believe it. Absurd, isn't it? But if you wrap this in a beautiful legend, add wonders, lightning, burning bushes, opened heavens, and dress it in solemn words, people begin to believe, especially if the alternative is an accusation of heresy, exile, or something worse. But that's exactly how everything worked before. Today we understand that laws are written by people in the State Duma or Parliament to govern the country. Even if these laws are adopted in the interests of a narrow group, we realize that specific individuals stand behind them rather than higher powers. Earlier it was asserted, laws are written by God. Pay attention to the terminology. The Torah is translated as law. The 5 books of Moses, received on Mount Sinai, are called Torat Moshe, the law of Moses. The Bible contains the Old Testament and the New Testament. A covenant is a contract, an agreement, and in a broader sense, a set of rules, a legislative code. The Quran, transmitted through the Archangel Gabriel, was also referred to as the Turkish law. 3 major religious systems, 3 supposedly sacred texts, and all of them in their names directly point to the legal nature. The law of Moses was given 1,000 years before the coming of Jesus Christ. Then Jesus Christ appeared with his additions and amendments to the old law, forming the New Testament. Another 600 years later, Muhammad came with the Quran, which the Archangel Gabriel dictated to him over 20 years. 3 laws in 3 languages for 3 territories. If the laws were truly given by God thousands of years ago and are unchangeable, why have they had to be changed every 600 to 1,000 years? Why were amendments needed? Perhaps it is not about God at all, but rather that those who controlled the territories changed, and each new ruler needed their own tool of governance. Laws are not written in any language. Laws are written in the language of power, in the language of the empire. And this is where discrepancies begin, which official history carefully overlooks. Why is Jewish law written in Greek? Why did Islamic law spread precisely within the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire? The language of the law reveals who actually created it. The Quran is supposedly written in Arabic. Look at the map of the spread of Islam. These are the lands of the Ottoman Empire and the territories under its influence. The Torah is supposedly written in ancient Hebrew, but there exists the Septuagint, a translation of holy texts into Greek. Why Greek? Because Judea was a province of the Eastern Roman Empire, the same one that would later be incorrectly referred to as Byzantium. The name Byzantium appeared much later, and in reality, it was the Eastern Roman Empire with its center in New Rome, that is, Constantinople. Greek served as the administrative language in all provinces of this empire. There was no ancient Greece and ancient Rome thousands of years before this. These are legends created to artificially extend the chronology. Constantine the Great was not a Byzantine emperor. He was a Roman emperor who moved the capital to New Rome. His full name was Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantine, and it is said that he made Christianity the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. But if you look closely, he did not make Christianity a religion. He made it a law. All provinces lived by one Greek law because this law was believed to be given by God himself. Did the other provinces of the empire live without laws? Of course not. They lived by the very same law, recorded in the administrative language. But then the law was decided to be changed. Greek was replaced by Latin. The Vulgate appeared, the Latin version of the Bible, which includes the New Testament. Later, in the mid-15th century, the Gutenberg Bible was printed, the first printed edition in Latin. This was not just a change of the translation language. It was a change of jurisdiction, a transfer of power, the establishment of a new order. Greek was the language of the Eastern Roman Empire, while Latin became the language of the West. The split between East and West, which historians date to the 11th century, actually occurred much later and was associated not with theological disputes over the filioque, but with the redrawing of spheres of influence and the establishment of different legal systems in different territories. If God dictates the law in the administrative language of the empire, then divine revelation becomes a political tool. Laws changed not because God had reconsidered or supplemented his teachings. Laws changed because the power over the territories changed, and the new rulers needed a new tool for controlling the population. The change of the language of law is equal to the change of power over the empire. The old Greek law was replaced by Latin law. But what happened to those who continued to live by the old law? They were persecuted. And this is where a dreadful story unfolds, which official science presents as religious conflicts, although in reality, it was a legal cleansing. When talking about the substitution of God the Almighty for God Jesus Christ, about the replacement of Old Testament faith with New Testament faith, this is a simplified explanation for understanding. In reality, it is about the replacement of the law. The Old Testament law was replaced by the New Testament law. Icons served as a visual reflection of this change. Images were rewritten, inscriptions were changed, symbols were adjusted. Christian holidays were imposed on pagan folk ones. There was a struggle against rituals, spells, and folklore. Persecution of harpists, buffoons, magi, and healers. People were driven into churches, even though the churches stood empty. The pantheon of pagan gods was replaced by the pantheon of Christian saints. The prophet Elijah became the thunderer instead of Perun. Nicholas the miracle worker took the place of other patrons. Similarly, there was a substitution of Old Testament saints for New Testament ones. The mother with 3 daughters, faith, hope, love, which essentially are the main Christian virtues, turned into specific characters. This is an image, simpler and fitting for the new law. Icons were rewritten, signed, and crosses were added to churches. And do not think that the icons were redone and edited only among us. European frescoes also underwent adjustments. Saints were renamed, entire plots were painted over and rewritten. In the Middle Ages, nationalities were determined not by genetics, not by skin color, not by place of birth. Nationality meant religious confession, that is, adherence to a specific law. Latins were those who followed Latin law. Greeks were adherents of Greek law. Jews were those who adhered to Moses' law. These are not racial groups, but legal categories. A person could be born into one family, but accept another law and become a representative of another nationality. Transitioning from one category to another meant a change in jurisdiction, a change in the legal system under which you live. This is why conflicts between different groups were so sharp. It was not an interethnic hostility, but a struggle of legal systems for control over territories and populations. Jews did not spread throughout the world, forming diasporas in different countries. They were subjects of the empire who continued to observe the old law. Medieval persecution of Jews was not based on national identity, but for refusing to accept the new law. They were pursued for stubbornly following the law of Moses, when the New Testament had already been written and everyone was instructed to live by new rules. The official history claims that Jews were persecuted for their ancestors having crucified Jesus Christ in the 1st century. But this is absurd. If the crucifixion occurred in the 1st century, Why did mass persecutions only begin in the 15th? Did people harbor resentment for 14 centuries? Were they waiting for the right moment? The explanation is illogical and frankly false. Historians offer a version about popular outrage that suddenly flared up 1,500 years after the event. The real reason is that the New Testament was written in the 15th century, not in the 1st. Until that moment, it simply did not exist, which is why the persecutions began precisely then. The old law was declared invalid, and those who continued to observe it were persecuted as violators of the new order. The heresy of the Judaizers during the time of Ivan III is the same story. Metropolitan of all Rus Zosima and the Grand Prince Ivan III, the grandfather of Ivan the Terrible, were considered supporters of the Judaizers, but in reality, they were adherents of the old faith, the old law. Usually, the Metropolitan was appointed by Byzantine colleagues from the Patriarchate of Constantinople, but this time, Rus decided to act independently, refusing to accept the imposed changes. This later grew into a church schism and persecution of the old believers. The church at that time was the legislative authority, and those who refused to comply with the new legal code were persecuted. The struggle was not for the purity of faith, but for control over the legal system. In the 15th century, something critical happened. It was then that the New Testament began to be written. It was then that the persecution of the old faith began. It was then that Tartaria started to disappear from the maps. What happened in those decades? The 5 patriarchates, Roman, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, were not independent religious centers. They were 5 provinces of a single empire, 5 administrative centers. This is what is called pentarchy. All these regions were part of the Roman Empire. Antioch, Constantinople, Alexandria, key trading points of the Mediterranean, seaports through which governance extended into the continents. It is an illusion of choice, the appearance of diversity amid complete unity of the system. The ecumenical councils they held were not spiritual gatherings of holy fathers. They were legislative assemblies for the development of a unified system of governance for humanity. At these councils, they decided how to further govern people, what rules to introduce, which doctrines to declare obligatory. The Ferrara Florentine Council, which took place from 1438 to 1445, is officially called an attempt to unite the churches. In reality, a new law was being accepted, the New Testament. Dogmas about God as a sacrifice in Jesus Christ were voiced, forming a doctrine that was to be spread across all controlled territories. The laws were divine, but they were adapted differently for each locality so as not to irritate the population too much. The task was not to destroy people, but to manage them, to collect tribute, to establish control. The same law took different forms depending on the region, but the main thing remained unchanged: the promise of something wonderful for obedience. Do your homework. You will go for a walk. Work hard. You will get a promotion. Give me part of your salary every month, and when you become old and frail, I will provide for you. The same system that the pension fund uses today. The promise of happiness later, not now, but perhaps after the end of life. Muslims are promised virgins in paradise. For what purpose? For a chess tournament or something else? Who are these virgins? Genetically modified clones? Paradise bio-robots? Someone's real daughters? Women were not offered such a celebration after parting. Everything is built on simple carnal passions, desires and fears. You will burn in the fiery Gehenna. How to burn if the body is already dead and the spirit does not burn? But it cannot be explained to the ordinary person. However, the image of eternal torment on a hot frying pan is clear. In paradise, happiness. In hell, torment. That is all one needs to know. Rus refused to accept the decisions of this council, rebelled, and for the first time appointed its own metropolitan without agreeing with Constantinople. Pay attention to the temporal anomaly. Ecumenical councils were held with a certain regularity, approximately once every 100 to 200 years. But between the 19th Council of Trent, which concluded in 1563, and the 20th Vatican Council, which began in 1869, there was more than 300 years of complete silence. What happened in those 3 centuries? Why did the tradition of regular councils suddenly break? What processes were occurring at that time that did not require high-level legislative assemblies? The answer is that these 300 years were spent on the physical implementation of the decisions made, on the introduction of new laws, on erasing old memories. In the 15th century, Tartary was still present on maps. By the 18th century, it had completely disappeared. The 300-year gap between the councils coincides with the period of erasure of memory about Tartary. During this time, historical documents were written, such as the travels of Marco Polo and Carpini with their dogs on the ice. During this time, fake chronologies about ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and the Mongol Tatar yoke were created. A Turkish law was written, the Quran, specifically for the Ottoman Muslims. They were given Constantinople in 1453, immediately after the Florence Council. Pay attention to this date. The Florence Council ended in 1445, and 8 years later, Constantinople fell. Coincidence? They were given Judea to finish off the remnants of the Old Testament adherents, those who stubbornly clung to the old law. The world was divided according to laws. America received the law of Jesus Christ, which was brought there by Christopher Columbus. In the 7,000th year, in 1492, according to modern calculations, preparations were being made for the end of the world. And the end of the world came. The New World began. The discovery of America turned out to be the discovery of a new world, where a new counting of time was initiated. Christopher, the bearer of Christ, carrying the word of God across the ocean. A literal translation of the name. Missionaries exchanged the faith of Christ for everything that could be taken from the local residents. Christianization was essentially colonization. They brought faith and took gold. To the Islamic lands, the Quran, the remnants of Tartary underwent cleansing. In the 15th century, the process only began, but it was completed only 300 years later. How was the memory of Tartaria and the old law physically erased? Through the legislative consolidation of the new reality at councils. The Council of Trent, which took place from 1545 to 1563, is officially called the council at which the Nicene Creed was confirmed, supposedly adopted in the 6th century. The name tridentum itself translates as 3 teeth, a trident, a symbolic designation. But why was there a need to confirm unshakable dogmas 1,000 years after their supposed acceptance? If the dogmas were established in the 6th century and considered unchangeable foundations of faith, why did they need to be confirmed in the 16th? What changed over that 1,000 years that required reaffirmation? Historians are silent or mumble something vague about the necessity to confront the Reformation, about the struggle against heresies. The answer is simple and terrible. At the Council of Trent, the dogmas of the Trinity, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, were accepted for the first time. There was no Council of Nicaea in the 6th century. This is a falsification of chronology, created to give the new law the appearance of antiquity. The Gutenberg Bible, the first printed edition, was published immediately after the Ferrara-Florentine Council in Latin with the New Testament. If the dogmas existed in the 6th century, why print them in the 15th as something new? 20 to 30 years after the Council of Trent, in 1589, the Patriarchate is established in Russia. The Russian Church becomes independent, so we are told. But who consecrated the first Russian Patriarch? The Greek Patriarch of Constantinople, Jeremias II, the same one who signed the Florentine Union with Rome 100 years ago, confirming the primacy of the Pope. Independence turns out to be an illusion. The Russian Patriarchate was established by the same system that created Latin law and erased the memory of Tartary. Now the picture comes together completely. The 15th century, the New Testament began to be written and fake travels about barbarian Tatars with dogs in the ice. The 16th century, the Council of Trent established new dogmas, presenting them as ancient. The 17th and 18th centuries. Tartary was wiped off maps, memory was cleansed, new textbooks were written, old manuscripts were destroyed. By the 19th century, only buildings with gigantic scales remained from the former civilization, with their first floors buried, technologies of which the new inhabitants do not understand and cannot use. The church lost its former power, no longer writes laws directly, but the system of governance transformed rather than disappeared. The parish priest knew everything about his parishioners thanks to confession. Today, it is enough to look into messengers, social networks, track online purchases, and movements through the phone. Control remained, the tools just changed. But all this, of course, is for our good. Religion turns out to be a law, a tool for control after the catastrophe. Sacred texts were written in the 15th and 16th centuries by people for a specific purpose, to manage the ruins of a fallen empire. The Great Empire, which occupied half a continent on maps, faced a series of destructive events. Floods washed away coastal cities, buried streets under mud and silt, burying entire floors beneath a new level of earth. The nuclear winter, recorded in chronicles as the year without summer in 1816, destroyed crops, led to famine, and ruptured trade links. The survivors found themselves cut off from centers of knowledge, technological chains collapsed, and literacy became accessible to a few. In this chaos, new rulers arrived with a ready-made system of control, religion, disguised as divine revelation. They offered a simple deal: obedience in exchange for the promise of heavenly bliss, the fear of eternal torment as a guarantee of order. The mechanism worked flawlessly, as either the bearers of old memory were gone, or they were silenced, and libraries and archives mysteriously burned in fires every time uncomfortable evidence could have been stored there. A unified civilization with a single language, remnants of which we see in Sanskrit and Proto-Slavic, was replaced by a multitude of nationalities. However, in the Middle Ages, nationalities meant religion, adherence to a specific law. Latins are those who follow Latin law. Greeks are adherents of the Greek law. Jews are those who observe the law of Moses. Persecutions of heretics were a legal cleansing of those who remembered the old laws. The travels of Marco Polo, the notes of Carpini, the chronicles of the Crusades, all this literature was created retrospectively to shape the desired image of the past. The wild world of barbarians, needing Christian civilization. Ignorant peoples, whom Europeans bring enlightenment. Dangerous lands, inhabited by monsters and heretics. This narrative justified any actions of missionaries and conquerors. The ecumenical councils of the 15th and 16th centuries served as legislative assemblies, where the fate of continents was decided. Who will receive America? What law to establish in the former lands of Byzantium? How to divide influence between patriarchates? 300 years between the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council were needed to implement the decisions made. Old toponyms were erased, inconvenient archives were burned, chronicles were rewritten, and new cartography was created. Every time you open a sacred book, ask yourself, who benefited from you believing that the laws of people are the laws of God? Who gained power by declaring legal codes as divine revelations? And most importantly, what do they hide behind a millennia-long false chronology? The traces of this global system are scattered across all continents. Christianity became established in Europe and through Columbus penetrated into America, where it was imposed by fire and sword among the indigenous population. Islam gained control over the lands of the Ottoman Empire, engulfing Constantinople and the holy sites of Judea. Judaism was pushed to the periphery, driven into closed quarters, turning into a living reminder of the old order, which no longer submits to anyone. Each of these systems functioned as a legal code for a specific region, establishing rules of life, trade, punishments, and family relationships. The technological achievements of the previous era, those very fountains that operated without pumps due to the hydraulic pressure of natural water bodies, halls with perfect acoustics designed based on mathematical proportions, domes held up by principles that modern engineers are rediscovering through trial and error. All of this was declared as divine miracles. It is more convenient that way. A miracle does not require explanations and does not raise questions about who actually possessed this knowledge. Power has always disguised itself as a higher will. In the past, rulers claimed that they received authority directly from the heavens. Today, the same mechanisms operate under different names: democracy, popular will, national security. The packaging changes, but the content remains the same. Some write the rules, others must obey. The great empire, whose cities stretched from ocean to ocean, did not fall in battles. It was destroyed differently, erased from collective memory, replaced by new narratives. Old maps were reprinted without uncomfortable names. Chronicles were rewritten, adding 1,000 years of non-existent history. And when someone found contradictions, they were told that these were errors of the transcribers or misunderstandings of medieval cartographers. The question is not whether you are ready to see the deception. The question is what you will do when you see it. The sacred texts that you were told to read since childhood were created not in the heavens, but at negotiation tables by people pursuing specific political goals. Divine revelation turns into a diplomatic document, heavenly commandments, into articles of the criminal code. This system functions to this day. Instead of councils, summits are held. Instead of bulls, resolutions are issued. Instead of excommunication from the church, sanctions are applied. Control has not disappeared. It has evolved, adapted, become less noticeable, but it is no less effective.